The next video for the asynchronous portion of September 11th class is going to be our first dip into how we actually create new pieces of data. Right? The previous three videos have really been about the concept of how data displays itself in ArcPro and ArcGIS, dealing with this concept of coordinate systems, how three-dimensional data is made two-dimensional, how we fix challenges when we can't see our data, and all that tends to deal with existing pieces of data. But even more important should also be how we build and create new pieces of data. And this is going to be a consistent theme throughout this class. There are multiple ways that you can do it. Two that we'll cover in this video are XY coordinates. It's a very common way to create data. And that's where you might take something that exists in a table, on a spreadsheet, on a piece of paper, and so long as it has these coordinates, right, these concepts that I was talking about in a previous video, right, that tell you where you're supposed to be in the world, you can turn what is a piece of paper into dots on a map. The other one we'll talk about in this video is editing. The concept of editing is something we'll return to regularly throughout the semester, but we'll learn it in its most basic form right now, and that simply is actually creating a raw piece of data from scratch. That's what editing actually means, how you sort of build a new shapefile, draw something that was never there before. The tools we learn in editing can also be used to edit, as the name would imply, existing data, but we'll pepper that in throughout the semester in other lessons. These are two critical ways of getting data in, but are by no means the only ones. Others we may experiment with through the semester is how you use address data. Very similar to XY coordinates, if you have address data, just like we see in Google, you can use that to actually map and create shapes. You can make data by joining. It's another concept we'll learn soon. If you have a piece of data and then you have some information, you can join them together to make some form of super data. Later in class, we'll learn how you might take an image, right? Something that's a paper-based map or a PNG, but that is definitely part of the world, and get it so that it depicts itself on a map. So there are innumerable ways to sort of create data, sometimes from scratch like we're doing, sometimes even as the output of analytics like we'll do later in the semester. So let's do the first one, simplest one, which is edit XY data. I bring this right up from the start because this should be built into your minds that if you ever access a piece of data and somewhere in that data it has an X and a Y coordinate, you are golden and you can map it. You can see it looks like a table over here, Philadelphia artists xy.dbf. That concept dbf, that's the version of a database file that ArcPro will allow itself to read, right? So it can only process and it can only read .dbfs, but this is something that we'll cover more extensively in the class on September 18th. So for now, just drag it in. If you right-click and open its attribute table to look, reminder from previous video, always look at the attributes and ask yourself, what do the rows mean? Okay, each row seems to be an artist, and it's an artist that was either born here or met in Philadelphia. What do the columns seem to be? All right, well, they tell us, their connection to Philly, who they are, and some interesting things here, some coordinate systems. Now, this is what I was meaning to show you earlier, right? We have coordinate systems that I designed to be in two different ways. You have xmin and ymin. Don't worry about min, that means nothing. Same thing with max. These are just two different sort of units, and they look different. This is the one that's in decimal degrees, right? Decimal degrees puts the world on a graph, an xy coordinate. The x-axis is -180 to 180. The y-axis is -90 to 90. And that would put you on a quadrant with the x-axis being the equator and the y-axis being the prime meridian. That is effectively how you turn a three-dimensional shape into a two-dimensional piece of graph paper. So by using these coordinates, I would say you can find me where Diplo sort of and his crew met in Philadelphia, and where they lived and grew up, and where the Disco Biscuits met at school, where Will Smith was born, where where Amos Lee was born, where Hall & Oates met in part of West Philly, or I think possibly even out towards Upper Darby. But this is XY coordinates, and they're mapped quite easily. They're mapped through the great power of right-click, right? Easiest way to get here is to right-click, pop on down to display XY data. A similar table will pop up over here on the side. What am I doing? What do I want to save it as? You know, sometimes when you do this, it's always good to put an output somewhere. You know, so click on that folder, or else it's just going to save it to a concept called a geodatabase, which we'll learn about briefly in the next video on editing. And come on over here, and let's just say, you know, Philly artists, or give it a name, save. And this is the most critical part of this entire exercise. Now, if I were to just do this now, it would fail. And here is why. It's asking me what the x-coordinate is. And I'm saying it's x-min and y-min. That's perfectly fine. But I'm telling it your x-coordinates are in feet, right? Or some other gobbledygook number right here. Your y-coordinates are in feet, or some other gobbledygook number. But this sneaky hidden little thing down here is actually saying to you, hey, those units you're giving me here, what coordinate system are they in so I can read them? And by saying this one, the basic for the map, GCS, WGS, we're saying it's decimal degrees, right? You see how if I click on it, kind of briefly shows up unit degree, sort of in that second thing. So we'd be saying, try to map yourself at these degrees which don't exist. So if I wanted this to work, I'd have to pick Philly correct, and then it would know that the units were feet, and it would map it. Or I could go the other way and say, hey, why don't you do the x max, which I know is decimal degree, and the y max, which I know is decimal degree, run it, and then I have a super useful, super important tool that allows me to take what existed on a piece of paper and finally have it on a map. Now I have a point. What's the point of a point? Shows you where you happen to be so you can depict some information. So we'll use XY coordinates fairly regularly throughout the semester. I do find them to be probably one of the most useful skills to learn in GIS because it instantly allows you to take what was once just information and suddenly have geography. Now we know the distance to each of their houses. Now we can find out where the central point was. Now we could measure which neighborhood had sort of the highest density. Now we could compare them to their neighborhood surroundings and try to do a statistical analysis to see if there were conditions that were similar in each of the neighborhoods that, help incubate a Philadelphia artist. None of that we could have done when it existed on paper, but now it exists as a point on the map.